It's an immense honor and pleasure to have with us here in November 2024 for the anniversary edition of Living Histories, Professor Nigel Goldenfeld, who is going to tell us how he studies biology for the wrong reasons, also known as living histories. Yours, Nigel.
Thank you. So I set my timer for 9 minutes, 30 seconds, and then we can have questions. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. Um, I describe myself as a reluctant biophysicist. In fact, I hardly imagine that I even am classified as a biophysicist. The reason is that I study biology for the wrong reasons. And so I will try to tell you about that and try to answer some questions at the end if people wish to know them. So I guess where I really want to start is why would a physicist study biology? So I've been doing research now for about 40 years. I guess my professional lab as a professor will be 40 years next year. And I spent about 20 years of that trying to avoid biology as hard as I could, even though I was working on pattern formation and non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and dynamical systems. And it never really occurred to me that I would become a biologist or biophysicist. Um, and I'll tell you how I eventually made that transition. So here are the reasons why I wouldn't study biology. It's messy, it's complicated. You need to know chemistry, which is for me almost a deal breaker. Everything in biology has an exception, and that's bad if you're a physicist who likes a universality. There's a huge diversity of phenomena, so what do you even choose to work on? And then lastly, what are the equations? Well, who knows? And where is the simplicity and the beauty that attracted many of us to theoretical physics in the first place? So those were pretty much deal breakers for me. I guess another one that I didn't list there was I really didn't think that I had anything to contribute to biology, and indeed I'm still not sure that I do. So um, when I looked around, I would see physicists studying biology, and they would do things like this. They would use physics to provide new tools to biologists. They would invent better microscopes, better ways to see living systems at all scales, better computer modeling techniques, better theoretical and analytical frameworks, tools for biomedical applications such as drug delivery. And so, I wasn't sure that I would be interested in doing any of those or capable of it. Um, there's other people who study biology and they do it because they want to copy the design principles discovered by evolution, for example, in neuromorphic computer engineering. So for all these reasons, I kept away from biology. I did study pattern formation. I studied complex systems, and it eventually became clear to me that a lot of what people were doing in complex systems I didn't find very convincing, and so I thought I would like to understand a real complex system. Um, the one that I started with was computational or quantitative finance because there's lots of data there. And after that was in some sense the gateway drug to biology. But what really made me realize that there's something to do here is that you can use biology to provide new questions for physicists. So I kind of have the belief that everything is interesting if you look at it the right way. And I eventually found the right way to think about biology. And that is that, from my perspective, living systems expand the scope of physics. So here's some questions that I found. These are scientific questions, even though they don't sound it, and they haven't been answered. And they're not meant to be answered by people who are sort of being funded to research diseases and things like this. So let me just give a partial list here. Why does the phenomenon of life exist? Um, when we think we understand something as physicists, we understand two aspects of it. One is why the phenomenon exists at all, and the other is then how to calculate things quantitatively. And I thought that a lot of biology was trying to make detailed measurements and perhaps calculations of things, but leaving open the question of why the phenomenon even exists. How does matter self-organize into hierarchical, replicating, and evolvable structures? Why does life inexorably become more complex? That is the problem of the open-ended growth of complexity. How does life program itself, self-program, to adapt to wildly changing environments? How can living systems even work when the number of particles is not thermodynamically large? You have strong fluctuations, yet they work with exquisite fine-tuning, hardly making an error. This was very surprising to me when I started thinking about it. And then how do I even think about living systems, which are definitely far from equilibrium? They're spatially extended, they're pattern forming, they're heterogeneous, they're dynamical, and they may not have steady states or stationary probability distributions. So very, very challenging scientific questions. The areas where I started working first were the areas closest to my interests in physics. So I started working, because I work on pattern formation and dynamical systems, I was naturally drawn to evolution and ecology. So my first papers were on ecology. And right off the bat, I felt that if I didn't do field work, I wasn't really doing something that was meaningful. So I ended up doing field work at Yellowstone National Park with Bruce Falk, a wonderful geomicrobiologist, studying the distribution of bacteria in geothermal hot springs. And my backup plan was that if that turned out to be uninteresting, I would just work out the pattern formation of why the geothermal hot spring landscape was so weird. It looks like a bunch of cascading terraces within terraces. And in fact, we ended up doing both of those. And one of my students, his thesis has a picture of me at like 3 o'clock in the morning doing titrations on an outcrop in the freezing cold. So we really did the field work, and it was essential for the science that we did. I then worked with Carl Rose, who was my mentor. We worked on the evolution of the genetic code and other areas in evolution. He was incredibly patient and kind, answered my questions, gave me a lot of time, and we worked together on a pretty much daily basis for the last 12 years of his life. I want to end with some take-home messages for starting out theoretical biophysicists. These are things that I don't know if they're universally true, but they seem to be true for me. The value that you potentially add is your way of looking at the world. That can mean something as simple as knowing the right level of description to start with. A biologist friend might say, well, we'd like to make a model of this. How do we do it? Do you do an all-atom simulation? Do you make some Landau theory? What do you do? Physicists are very conscious of the way that they model things and think about things. I also felt that it was wrong to try to become a biologist with better math skills. That wasn't really the object of the exercise. It was to add something different, something qualitatively new, a new dimension. I felt it was really important to work with biologists who resonate with you, especially with experimentalists, and don't be afraid to be in the lab or in the field. And then the other thing I find interesting when I started working in biology was that modeling is not the same thing as theory. And my friends who are biologists confused the two. They would say, why don't we model this? And modeling for them was finding an equation that would make a curve that would go through the data points. Whereas I wanted to do theory, which is try to figure out what happens outside of the data points, what is outside of the data set, making new qualitative predictions. So those were some of the things that I found, from my experience, as such as it is. I also found that doing biology did make me a better physicist. One of the problems that I've worked on, and is quite well known now, that I worked on in the last 10 years, was on the transition to turbulence. That problem actually ended up turning out to be in the same universality class as the extinction transition in the predator-prey ecosystem. And I wouldn't have been able to solve that problem if I hadn't already been primed with knowing a lot about stochastic predator-prey dynamics. So let me leave you with a quote that I really like. It's by Stan Ulam, and what he says is, he paraphrases John F. Kennedy. He says, ask not what physics can do for biology, ask what biology can do for physics. And for me, the answer is it really expanded the scope of what physics is, because biological phenomena are part of the natural world. So that's all I want to say. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Nigel, for a wonderfully inspiring talk. On behalf of the audience, I'm clapping. And audience, please feel free to send your questions to me via chat. I will start with a question building off of what you said about uh, possibly what you have to offer as a researcher is the unique perspective you bring to the question based on your own tastes and experiences. So I want to ask you how, especially if you've had an interesting trajectory and an unusual way of looking at things, you survive a system which selects for conforming. Or do you
Oh,
agree with the premise of the question?
yeah, no, I know, I understand what you're asking. Yeah, the system does select for conformity. You're totally right. Um, so I think the answer is that you the way I mean the way that the system that you're talking about is primarily for example, funding system, or for me, I already had tenure and things like this, so I already had a position that in some sense was privileged, and but it was remarkable to be able to get funding for the things I wanted to do, and that was really just luck. Rita Colwell became the director of the National Science Foundation. She had a view of biology that was remarkably fresh. She founded a program called Biocomplexity, and she really understood as a microbiologist all the many facets of biology that need to be integrated into understanding biological systems, not just viewing them in isolation. And so that enabled me to get funding. And then there were other funding mechanisms in NSF that were along those same lines. So, but I think mainly I did always work with very mainstream biological scientists, and sometimes I would discover things that they wouldn't believe, that they were just staggered by. Like I worked with Gene Robinson on social for many years. We had a long collaboration on honeybees. We did many things. We did genomics and stuff like that. One of the most interesting things we did was look at their social networks by barcoding 1,000 bees in a hive, watching everything that they did and who they interacted with, and so on and so forth. And what we discovered was unequivocally that honeybees in a hive have their own individuality. They're not all just drones. They're not just ideal gas particles floating around. They actually have something individual about them, and we could actually measure that and quantify it. And when we discovered that from looking at how long they spent doing trophallaxis, interacting with each other and transferring food to each other. He just didn't believe that. It was just against the status quo. So then we figured out a model-free way that we could demonstrate that without using any modeling at all. And so I think that was very important. The biologists did learn from the things that we did, and we discovered surprising things that if I'd been trained as a biologist, we probably never would have done those things. Does that answer your question at all, Sri?
Yes, thank you. There are many, many more questions, and I will connect you with some of those questions via chat. But in the interest of time, um, I will just ask you one more question, which is the following, which is that you talked about ask what biology can do for physics. In that spirit, um, traditional physics coursework, do you agree, leaves something to be desired since many of our experiences is that we never see adaptive systems in coursework. Given that, how does one how does one follow how does one take this approach that you're advocating for?
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for the question. I agree that when you're teaching trainees in biophysics, you have to teach them things that are different from the physics curriculum, but at the same time, they need to learn the physics curriculum. At least from my perspective, all my students were condensed matter students, and they were trained in condensed matter physics. They knew quantum field theory. We use quantum field theory in our work on ecology, for example, and I always give my students physics problems first because I want them to know how to think like a physicist, which I think is different from other disciplines, although maybe I'm wrong about that. Because I want them to know that, know how to solve impossible problems, know how to turn things around and think of them in unconventional ways, and so on and so forth. And then work on biology. So that's the route I'm saying of don't try to become a biologist with better math skills. If you could train yourself to learn lots of biology courses and you happen to know calculus, so some of the questions, some of the problems are easy for you to work out and things like that. But I felt for me I wanted to keep that intellectual distance. Not that I don't love biology and working in it, although I hate the way it's taught. But I feel that the value I have to provide comes from my training as a physicist, even the things that I will not probably ever use in biology.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm closing the recording, but that was a very inspiring talk, and thank you for these thought-provoking answers.